The wooden floorboards creaked beneath Judith Morales as she moved through the dimly lit cabin, her swollen belly making each step deliberate and careful. The storm outside had been raging for 3 days now, and she knew Christopher Cox was exhausted from his constant vigilance over the property and livestock. His breathing was deep and steady from the master bedroom, the rhythm of sleep she had grown to recognize over the past months of working in his remote mountain home. What she didn't know was that behind his closed eyelids, Christopher was wide awake, testing something that had been gnawing at his conscience for weeks. The firelight cast dancing shadows across the rustic interior as Judith paused by the kitchen table, her hand resting protectively over her rounded stomach. 6 months pregnant and nowhere to go, she had been grateful when Christopher had offered her work as his housekeeper after her husband abandoned her in town. The other women had whispered cruel things about her situation, but Christopher had simply nodded when she explained her circumstances and told her the position came with room and board. Now, as the winter deepened and her pregnancy advanced, she wondered how long his patience would last. Christopher lay motionless in his bed, controlling his breathing to maintain the illusion of deep sleep. Through the crack in his bedroom door, he could see Judith moving about the main room, and his heart clenched at the sight of her obvious exhaustion. She had been working too hard, he knew, trying to prove her worth despite her condition. The test he had devised felt cruel now, but he needed to know the truth about her character before he made the decision that had been weighing on his mind. The decision that would change both their lives forever. If you are watching this story from anywhere in the world, drop your location in the comments below and give this video some hype to help it reach more people who need to hear stories of unexpected kindness and human dignity. The wind howled through the pine trees surrounding the isolated cabin, and Judith shivered despite the warmth from the stone fireplace. She moved toward the kitchen area, her movements careful and measured. Christopher had left his leather satchel on the counter before retiring, the same satchel she had seen him count money from earlier that evening. It contained his monthly earnings from the timber contracts, enough to sustain him through the harsh mountain winter. She knew this because she had helped him organize his papers, had seen the substantial amounts he dealt with regularly. Her stomach cramped suddenly, and she gripped the edge of the wooden counter, breathing through the discomfort. The baby had been restless lately, as if sensing her anxiety about the future. Where would she go when her time came? The nearest town was a day's ride away, and winter travel would be treacherous. Christopher had been kind to her, kinder than anyone had been since her husband's abandonment, but she couldn't expect him to care for her and a newborn child indefinitely. From his bedroom, Christopher watched as Judith steadied herself against the counter, her face pale in the firelight. Every instinct urged him to rise and help her, but he forced himself to remain still. The satchel lay open beside her, bills visible in the dim light. This was the moment he had orchestrated, though it felt like a betrayal of the trust she had shown him. He had deliberately left the money accessible, had made sure she saw him counting it, had even mentioned his plans to ride to town the following week to deposit it at the bank. Judith's gaze fell upon the open satchel, and for a long moment she simply stared at the money within. $50, perhaps more. Enough to buy passage somewhere warm, enough to find a room and wait for the baby to come. Enough to disappear before she became more of a burden than she already was. Her fingers trembled as she reached toward the leather bag, and Christopher's heart hammered in his chest as he watched from the shadows. But instead of taking the money, Judith carefully closed the satchel and moved it to a higher shelf, away from the edge of the counter where it might fall. She then began her evening routine of banking the fire and checking the window latches, the same careful attention to his property she had shown every night since arriving. Christopher felt a wave of shame wash over him as he realized what he had witnessed. Not theft, but protection. Not betrayal, but loyalty that ran deeper than her own desperate circumstances. The next morning brought a temporary break in the storm, and Christopher found Judith in the kitchen preparing breakfast despite the early hour. Her face was drawn with fatigue, and he noticed she was moving more slowly than usual. The test from the previous night had revealed everything he needed to know about her character, but now he faced the more difficult task of revealing his own intentions without exposing his deception. Christopher poured himself coffee from the pot she had prepared and sat at the rough wooden table. The morning light streaming through the windows illuminated the worry lines around her eyes, the way she unconsciously rubbed her lower back as she worked. He had been a fool to test her integrity when she had already proven it a dozen times over through her dedication and honest work. Now he needed to find the courage to offer her what he should have offered weeks ago. Judith served him eggs and bacon, the same hearty breakfast she prepared every morning, though he noticed she took only a small portion for herself. Her appetite had been poor lately, another sign of her advancing pregnancy and the stress she carried. She sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for him to speak. There was something different in her posture this morning, a resignation that alarmed him. Christopher cleared his throat, suddenly finding it difficult to form the words he had rehearsed. The deception of the previous night weighed heavily on his conscience, but the results had cleared away his last doubts about the path forward. He set down his coffee cup and looked directly at her, noting how she avoided his gaze. "Judith, I need to speak with you about your situation here," he began, and saw her shoulders tense immediately. She nodded, her hands moving protectively to her stomach in a gesture that had become habitual. "I know you have been worried about your future, about what will happen when the baby comes." Her voice was barely above a whisper when she replied, "I understand if you need me to leave, Mr. Cox. I know my condition makes things difficult, and I am grateful for the time you have given me to figure things out." The resignation in her tone confirmed his fears about her state of mind. Christopher leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped together on the table. "That is not what I am suggesting at all. In fact, I have a proposition that might benefit both of us, if you are willing to consider it." He paused, gathering his courage for what came next. "I am proposing that we enter into a marriage of convenience. You would have security and a home for your child, and I would have a permanent housekeeper and companion for the lonely winters ahead." The color drained from Judith's face, and for a moment Christopher feared she might faint. She gripped the edge of the table, her breathing shallow and rapid. "Mr. Cox, I could not ask such a thing of you. I have nothing to offer in return for such kindness. You would be taking on responsibilities that are not yours to bear." "The responsibilities would be mutual," Christopher replied firmly. "I am not a young man, Judith. This mountain life is hard, and having someone to share it with would be a blessing, not a burden. Your child would have my name and protection, and you would have security. It would be a practical arrangement that serves us both." Tears gathered in Judith's eyes as she processed his unexpected offer. "But what of love? What of the things that make a real marriage? I cannot pretend to feelings I do not have, and I would not want you to sacrifice your chance for true happiness." Christopher's expression softened as he considered her words. "I have had my chance at love, and it was taken from me by fever many years ago. What I am offering now is partnership, respect, and mutual care. Sometimes those things can grow into something deeper, and sometimes they are enough on their own. The choice would be yours to make." The wind picked up again outside, rattling the windows and reminding them both of their isolation in this harsh mountain wilderness. Judith wiped her eyes with her apron and took a shaky breath. "You would truly want this? A woman carrying another man's child, with nothing but her willingness to work hard to recommend her?" "I have observed your character these past months," Christopher said, thinking of the previous night's test and feeling another pang of guilt. "You are honest, hardworking, and kind. You care for this house as if it were your own, and you have never asked for anything beyond what you have earned. Those are qualities worth more than gold to a man like me." Judith stood slowly, her hand supporting her back as she moved to the window overlooking the snow-covered valley. The storm was building again, dark clouds gathering over the peaks. "I need time to think about this, Mr. Cox. It is a generous offer, more generous than I deserve, but I want to be certain I can be the partner you need." "Take all the time you require," Christopher assured her, "but know that my offer stands regardless of your answer. You will always have a home here, married or not, until you choose otherwise." That afternoon, while Christopher tended to the livestock in the barn, Judith sat by the fire and contemplated his proposal. The baby moved restlessly within her, as if sensing her emotional turmoil. Marriage to Christopher would solve her immediate problems, but it felt like accepting charity, and her pride rebelled against the idea. Yet what alternatives did she have? The nearest town offered few opportunities for a woman in her condition, and winter was closing in fast. She thought about Christopher's character, the quiet kindness he had shown her since her arrival. He was a man of few words but consistent actions, someone who had never made her feel ashamed of her circumstances or treated her with anything less than respect. If she were honest with herself, she had come to care for him in ways that went beyond gratitude. Perhaps a marriage based on mutual respect and practical considerations was not such a terrible foundation after all. When Christopher returned from the barn that evening, stamping snow from his boots and shaking ice from his coat, he found Judith waiting for him, with dinner prepared and a determined expression on her face. She had made his favorite stew, thick with vegetables from the root cellar and meat from the deer he had brought down the previous week. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the crackling fire providing a cozy backdrop to their meal. Finally, Judith set down her spoon and looked across the table at him with steady eyes. "I have considered your proposal, Mr. Cox, and I would like to accept it, with certain conditions." Christopher nodded, encouraging her to continue, while his heart began to beat faster with anticipation and relief. "First, I want to contribute equally to this partnership," Judith said firmly. "I will not be a burden or a charity case. I will work as hard as I am able, and when the baby comes, I will find ways to continue earning my place here." "Agreed," Christopher replied immediately, "though I reserve the right to insist you rest when necessary for your health and the child's. Second, I want honesty between us. No polite pretenses or walking on eggshells. If this arrangement stops working for either of us, we should be able to discuss it openly." Christopher felt the weight of his deception from the previous night, but nodded his agreement. "Complete honesty. You have my word. And third," Judith continued, her voice softer now, "I want the chance for this to become something real. I do not expect love immediately, but I hope we can build something genuine together for the child's sake as much as our own." Christopher reached across the table and took her hand in his weathered one. "I was hoping you would say that. I believe we have already begun building something real, Judith. This would simply make it official." The wedding took place the following week, when the storm finally broke enough for the circuit preacher to make his way up the mountain. It was a simple ceremony in the cabin's main room, with only the preacher and his wife as witnesses. Judith wore her best dress, let out to accommodate her growing belly, and Christopher had trimmed his beard and donned his only suit for the occasion. As they spoke their vows by the fireplace, with snow falling gently outside the windows, both felt the weight and promise of the commitment they were making. It was not the romantic wedding either might have dreamed of in their youth, but it was honest and hopeful in its own way. The months that followed brought their own challenges and rewards. Christopher proved to be a patient and considerate husband, never pressuring Judith for intimacy, but showing his care through countless small gestures. He carved a cradle for the coming baby, reinforced the cabin's walls against winter drafts, and made sure Judith had everything she needed for her confinement. Judith, for her part, threw herself into making their house a true home. She sewed curtains for the windows, organized Christopher's chaotic collection of books and papers, and cooked meals that filled the cabin with warmth and delicious aromas. More importantly, she began to open up to him about her past, her fears, and her hopes for their future together. One evening in late February, as they sat by the fire reading, Judith suddenly gasped and doubled over. Christopher was at her side immediately, his face pale with concern. "Is it time?" he asked, though they both knew the baby was not due for several more weeks. "I think so," Judith panted, gripping his hand tightly. "But it is too early. Something is wrong." Christopher helped her to their bed, and then rode through the treacherous mountain passes to fetch the midwife from the nearest settlement. The journey that normally took half a day stretched into a nightmarish ordeal of ice and snow, but he pressed on, driven by fear for Judith and the child she carried. The midwife, an experienced woman named Mrs. Patterson, arrived just as Judith's labor intensified. She examined the situation with professional calm and announced that while the baby was indeed early, everything appeared to be progressing normally. "Sometimes these little ones just decide they are ready to face the world," she said with a reassuring smile. Christopher paced the main room, while the sounds of labor echoed from the bedroom. He had faced down bears and mountain lions, had survived blizzards and avalanches, but nothing had prepared him for the helpless terror of waiting while Judith struggled to bring new life into the world. Every cry from the bedroom made him question whether he was strong enough for the responsibilities he had taken on. Near dawn, the baby's first cry pierced the mountain air, followed by Judith's exhausted sob of relief. "Mrs. Patterson emerged from the bedroom with a tiny bundle wrapped in one of Christopher's flannel shirts. "You have a daughter," she announced with satisfaction. "Small but healthy, and with a good, strong voice." Christopher approached the bundle with trembling hands, hardly daring to believe that this perfect little creature was now his responsibility. The baby's eyes were tightly closed, her tiny fists waving in the air as she announced her displeasure with the cold mountain morning. When he looked up at Mrs. Patterson, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Can I see her?" came Judith's weak voice from the bedroom, and Christopher carried the baby to her mother's side. Judith's face was pale and drawn with exhaustion, but her smile was radiant as she reached for her daughter. "She is beautiful," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you, Christopher. Thank you for making this possible." Christopher sat on the edge of the bed, watching as Judith examined every tiny finger and toe. "What shall we call her?" he asked softly. "I was thinking Rachel," Judith replied. "Rachel Cox, if that suits you." The name hit Christopher with unexpected emotion. Rachel had been his first wife's name, the woman he had lost to fever so many years ago. Judith could not have known this, yet somehow she had chosen the perfect way to honor both the past and the future. "Rachel Cox," he repeated, his voice thick with feeling. "It is perfect." As the weeks passed and Rachel grew stronger, the little family settled into new rhythms. Christopher proved to be a devoted father, rising for nighttime feedings and walking the floor with the baby when she was fussy. Judith marveled at his patience and gentleness with the tiny girl, seeing sides of him that his gruff exterior had hidden. One evening, as they sat together watching Rachel sleep in her cradle, Judith reached for Christopher's hand. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. "That night before you proposed, I saw the money in your satchel. I know you left it there deliberately, and I know you were testing me." Christopher's blood ran cold. He had hoped she would never realize what he had done, had lived with the guilt of his deception for months. "Judith, I understand why you did it," she continued, squeezing his hand gently. "You needed to know who I really was before you committed to this life with me. I am not angry, Christopher. I am grateful that you cared enough to be certain." Christopher turned to face her fully, his expression filled with remorse. "It was wrong of me to test you that way. You had already proven your character 100 times over. I let my fears override my judgment, and I am sorry." "Your fears were reasonable," Judith replied. "You were taking on a pregnant woman with no family and no resources. Any sensible man would have wanted to be certain of her honesty. The fact that you still offered me marriage after satisfying yourself of my character tells me everything I need to know about yours." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their daughter sleep and listening to the wind in the pines outside. Finally, Christopher spoke again. "I have something else to confess. That night I was testing you, watching you with the money. I realized something important. I was not just evaluating your character anymore. I was falling in love with you." Judith's breath caught in her throat. They had grown closer over the months of their marriage, had developed deep affection and respect for each other, but neither had spoken of love. "Christopher," she whispered, "I know we agreed this would be a practical arrangement," he continued, "but somewhere along the way, it became much more than that for me. Watching you care for our home, seeing your strength and kindness every day, holding our daughter and knowing that you trusted me enough to build this life with me, I fell completely and utterly in love with you." Tears gathered in Judith's eyes as she absorbed his words. "I fell in love with you too," she admitted. "I think it started that very first day, when you looked at me with respect instead of pity, when you offered me work instead of charity, when you made me feel like I had value again." Christopher leaned forward and kissed her gently, a kiss that held all the love and gratitude they had been building toward for months. When they separated, both were smiling through their tears. "So what happens now?" Judith asked softly. "Now we continue building the life we started," Christopher replied. "We raise our daughter together, we work this land together, and we love each other through whatever challenges come our way." As if summoned by their conversation, Rachel stirred in her cradle and began to fuss. Judith rose to tend to her, but Christopher gestured for her to stay seated. "Let me," he said, lifting the baby with practiced ease. Rachel settled immediately against his chest, her tiny hand curling around his finger. Watching her husband comfort their daughter, Judith felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. Less than a year ago, she had been abandoned and pregnant, facing an uncertain future with no resources and little hope. Now she sat in a warm home beside a man who loved her, watching him care for the child they were raising together. The test Christopher had devised that stormy night had revealed not just her character, but the depth of trust and love that was possible between two people who chose to build something real together. What had begun as a practical arrangement had grown into a true partnership, one based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection. Outside, the mountain wind continued its eternal song through the pine trees, but inside the cabin, three hearts beat in harmony. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting warm light over the family that had found each other against all odds. Rachel dozed contentedly in her father's arms, while her parents planned for the future they would build together. "I want to expand the cabin before next winter," Christopher said quietly, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "Add another room for Rachel. Maybe a proper parlor where you can have space for your sewing." Judith smiled at his thoughtfulness. "And I want to plant a garden in the spring, a real garden with vegetables and herbs, maybe some flowers by the front steps. Make this place feel even more like home." "It already feels like home," Christopher replied, looking around the room they had transformed together. "But I like the idea of flowers by the front steps." As the evening deepened and the fire burned lower, they talked quietly about their plans and dreams. Rachel would need schooling eventually, which might mean building a small schoolhouse for the scattered mountain families, or perhaps taking turns teaching the children themselves. There was talk of expanding Christopher's timber business, of building a better barn, of the possibility of more children in the years to come. All of these conversations were punctuated by the quiet contentment of a family that had found its rhythm. Christopher would rise to add wood to the fire. Judith would adjust Rachel's blanket, and they would settle back into their comfortable discussion of the future. The test that had once seemed like a betrayal now felt like the necessary catalyst that had brought them to this moment of perfect understanding. The storm that had raged outside during those early days of uncertainty had long since passed, but it had served its purpose. Like the harsh mountain winters that made the brief summers so precious, the difficulties they had faced together had only strengthened their appreciation for what they had built. As the night grew late and Rachel slept peacefully in her cradle, Christopher and Judith prepared for bed with the easy familiarity of a couple who had learned to move in harmony with each other. There was no awkwardness now, no uncertainty about their place in each other's lives. They had earned their happiness through honesty, hard work, and the courage to trust in something bigger than their individual fears. Judith paused at the window before joining Christopher in bed, looking out at the star-filled mountain sky. The same peaks that had once seemed like barriers now felt like protection, sheltering their little family from the outside world. The isolation that had once frightened her now felt like a blessing, giving them space to grow together without interference or judgment. "What are you thinking about?" Christopher asked softly from the bed. "How different everything is from what I expected," Judith replied, turning away from the window. "A year ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I had lost everything that mattered. And now I know I had not lost everything. I had just not found it yet." She climbed into bed beside him, settling against his shoulder with a contented sigh. "That night when you were pretending to sleep, watching to see what I would do with your money, you were not the only one being tested." Christopher's arm tightened around her. "What do you mean?" "I was testing myself too," Judith explained. "Testing whether I was the kind of person who deserved the kindness you had shown me. When I chose to protect your property, instead of taking what I needed, I was choosing who I wanted to be. Not just for you, but for myself and for Rachel." They lay together in comfortable silence, listening to their daughter's soft breathing from the cradle beside their bed. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting gentle shadows on the log walls. Outside, the mountain night was clear and cold, filled with the ancient peace of the wilderness. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had failed your test?" Judith asked quietly. Christopher considered the question seriously before answering. "I think I would have helped you anyway," he admitted. "By then, I was already falling in love with you. The test was really about my own fears, not about your character. I think I knew who you were, long before that night. Then why did you feel the need to test me at all? Because I was scared, Christopher replied honestly. Scared of being hurt again. Scared of making the wrong choice. Scared of taking on more responsibility than I could handle. The test was not really about you at all. It was about me finding the courage to trust my own judgment. Thing. Judith lifted her head to look at him in the dim light. And what did you learn? I learned that love requires faith, Christopher said simply. Faith in the other person, but also faith in yourself. Faith that you can handle whatever challenges come your way together. As they settled into sleep, both reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The test that had once seemed like a deception now felt like a necessary bridge between their individual fears and their shared future. It had forced them both to examine their true characters and motivations, clearing away the last barriers to genuine intimacy and trust. Rachel stirred in her sleep, making the soft sounds that had become the soundtrack to their evenings. In a few hours, she would wake for her feeding, and Christopher would rise with Judith to help care for their daughter. It was a routine they had established together, one of many small partnerships that made up their larger commitment to each other. The mountain cabin that had once sheltered a lonely man now housed a family bound together by choice, tested by adversity, and strengthened by love. The money that had served as a test now sat safely in the bank, earning interest toward Rachel's future education. The storm that had provided cover for Christopher's deception had passed, but it had left behind something far more valuable than clear skies. Outside, the eternal mountains stood guard over the valley, their peaks touched with starlight and promise. Inside the cabin, 3 hearts beat in the rhythm of home, of belonging, of love that had been tested and proven true. The wealthy mountain man's test had revealed not just his maid's character, but the depth of trust and commitment that was possible when 2 people chose to build something real together. The pregnant woman who had once frozen in place before an open satchel, full of money, now slept peacefully beside the man who had tested her, their daughter safe in her cradle nearby. What had begun as a deception had grown into the most honest relationship either had ever known, proving that sometimes the greatest tests reveal not our weaknesses, but our capacity for strength, love, and grace under pressure.